And so that's something where if that starts happening more, then like basically blockchains will just become unusable fairly quickly. But like between trying to attack the applications and between kind of traditional law enforcement tools of attacking people who participate in these applications who are careless, which actually happens a lot of the time, you can actually get very far.
I just have one more question to you, Vitalik, and maybe we'll have time to open the floor for the audience also to ask you a few questions. And my last question is really about the government or the governance of the community. As a lawmaker and a legislator, I think a lot about what would be the yardstick that we should hold to make sure that users' data and security is protected, and the integrity of the ecosystem is encouraged. And how do we ensure that government is always top down, but how do we ensure that this is still community driven? I see a lot of governments trying to get into this space. Government trying to issue their own digital currencies, and for example, Venezuela and some other countries, and also trying to regulate. But what are some of the most important advices that you give to governments, thinking about the space, the regulators, the lawmakers, and what are some of the missing pieces that are needed in today's blockchain development?
Sure. So one of them is also think about what services you can provide to be useful to the blockchain space. So one very simple one is just designing national ID cards in such a way that you can use them to sign digital signatures. Ideally, SEC-P256K1 compatible, but that's kind of shooting for the moon. The other example would be like very far-fetched, obviously, some kind of state-issued cryptocurrency. And I do think that state-issued cryptocurrencies can be an interesting way for kind of smaller countries to put themselves on a map, and basically have some kind of give them a kind of more proportional way to project some kind of economic power in the global economy, essentially. Also, I was on the regulatory side. I think I mentioned that cryptocurrency exchanging, project fundraising and so forth. There's kind of being friendly to that in the right way. I think is something that's very important. Encouraging a strong academic ecosystem. Sure. Since people want me to say something controversial, one thing I will say is that there was a slide I saw 2 presentations ago about how Asia is innovative, and the things that I saw there are basically number one, basically three exchanges coming up with tools that help people speculate better, and 3 other exchanges coming up with weird coin mechanisms, one of which basically was a $10 million bounty for people to spam the Ethereum blockchain. And no, that's not the innovation you want to be promoting. The kind of Asian innovation that's legitimately great is, number one, the researchers we have in Taiwan. Number 2, people like Omise Go, which is based in Thailand, working on Plasma. Number 3, the work that projects like Kyber and Zilliqa are doing in places like Vietnam and Singapore. Number 4, the original idea from Randao came from someone in China. Number 5, there's I believe the project of Reality Keys has one of its developers based in Japan, right? Those kinds of things are legitimately interesting cryptocurrency innovation. Tools that weird new financial schemes that incentivize people to come up with ways to get people to spend more and trade more on some exchange that's already making multi-billion-dollar profits. No, that's not the same thing that you need any more of. And so I think trying to support people both inside of academic institutions and inside of companies and just independent researchers and developers who are interested in participating in the ecosystem, and is I think something that actually is very valuable. Also, on the kind of use case front, and I think first of all, it's this idea of using like political blockchains for transparency in political campaigns is great. But once again, notice that this will be even more usable in practice if you had a state-issued cryptocurrency, because then you would be able to track donations in a fiat currency and not just in like something very volatile like ETH. Obviously, there's a lot of use cases in identity systems. Things like kind of participatory governance, including voting, like that's an area that needs to be kind of approached fairly carefully. And I think I mentioned before that I think like petitions are one area where it might actually be interesting to start. Because petitions are an area where, like, first of all, because a petition by itself is non-binding, it just, like, generally the way this works in various countries is that if you get enough signatures, you can either force the government to make a statement in response to a petition, or you can force them to actually have a proper vote on it. But the petition by itself is non-binding. So if the petition ends up agreeing on something that's total junk because the mechanism was broken, then there's some second layer that can stop it. And also, it is a nice kind of somewhat bounded risk, but still a use case that's still, I think, very interesting and potentially worth trying. And there's also a lot of interesting ideas around kind of local governance. And I've been talking to Glenn Weil, who's wrote that book on radical markets recently, and that has a lot of interesting ideas about quadratic voting and new kinds of kind of hybrid market democratic institutions that I think are interesting, and blockchain-based solutions can form part of implementing that. Like, I think ultimately the problem is that a lot of that side of things is fairly radical, and so you want to come up with a strategy by which it can be tested and kind of go up the scale pipeline from something like small-scale experiments to bigger-scale experiments, and eventually some kind of big national rollout.
Cool. We're doing some of what Vitalik has mentioned. We're now studying the possibility of issuing Taiwan global IDs. Super cool to allow global skilled workers to register as Taiwanese citizens digitally, and also we're coming out with blockchain ID system for Aboriginal tribes called BPCO. It's pretty cool for the digital identities to be organized on blockchain for all 32 tribes in Taiwan. So it's super exciting for them to kind of build their own sustainable economic system as well. Obviously, and also encouraging academic research. I think so important of us here are the guardians of the technology, are the guardians of the blockchain and Ethereum. So we must think carefully on the actions we take and also on the words that we spread out. So with that, I wanted to just open the questions. You want to say?
I think I have my controversial statement.
Okay,
so
great.
Number one, here's the uncontroversial statement that most people agree with. 95% of all cryptocurrency applications are crap and are going to fail. The controversial, the obvious but surprisingly controversial corollary, there is a 95% chance that includes yours.
I think that's super good. So I'm gonna open the. Okay, good. I think everybody heard it. Yeah. I hope they all did again. Okay, so any questions from the floor? Anyone? Okay, we have one here. Okay, just make it short. Make sure you ask. Can someone? Okay, so can someone hand a question, microphone to this gentleman here? Or you can just shout out your name and what you do.
Hi, Jordan Wood from Arcade Ventures. Thank you very much for your insights and talent. A lot of discussion about the consumer side. Just would like to get your opinion on vision change the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance.
Sure.
And the whole business ecosystem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So the question is basically, what do I think about the provision/enterprise side of things? And that's definitely a great question, and I think it's one that we definitely don't talk about enough. I actually do think there's a lot of opportunity for like even large enterprises to move toward paradigms that are not fully centralized, and also not fully decentralized either, because that's a lot of the time not practical. But at least take one step toward decentralization that actually gives meaningful scale security guarantees, right? So one simple, so I personally am actually kind of less bullish on consortium chains than I was 1 to 2 years ago. And the reason why is that basically, from what I've seen of consortium chains so far in practice, is that the way they tend to be structured in reality, just because of that's how businessy, enterprise, social, political forces seem to work, is that they actually don't really provide that much meaningful decentralization. So for example, there was one Chinese project that I remember presenting a while back that talked about how, oh, we have this consortium chain and it's a real live blockchain use case that's been operating by over a year. And when they talk about their structure, they're like, oh, we have 7 nodes and all 7 nodes are run by our company, by the same teams. So, and that's, I feel, unfortunately all too representative of what people end up meaning when they say permission consortium chain. Ultimately, I think if you want, I fully recognize the need for compromise between centralization and and the practicality of that first, and decentralization and kind of the idealistic motives on the other side, right? But I think there are good and bad ways of making that compromise, and I think personally, I'm actually currently very kind of bullish and enthusiastic about state channels and Plasma in particular as ways of satisfying that compromise, because what those technologies do is they basically give you the safety guarantees of a public blockchain, because you have this guarantee that says even if the centralized server shuts down, any user can always withdraw their assets and switch them to a different centralized provider. And those guarantees are enforced by a smart contract that lives on the fully decentralized public chain. But where you still get basically most of the efficiency gains of running the thing on a server. Right, the only kind of extra cost that you have to add is that basically you now have to have an API where you feed updated Merkle branches to every client. But these days we have increasingly blazing fast internet, and so feeding a Merkle branch to a client every 14 seconds is actually kind of trivial. So I think, and for state channel,